Chapter 12. Oliver was worried. It had been half an hour since training was supposed to start, but there was still no sign of Mr. Chapman. He was never late. What could have happened? Just then, Oliver heard a rumbling noise from afar. He turned to see a giant tree galloping towards him, a cloud of dust trailing in its wake. And on its branches, there were people sitting like crows perched on the tree. As the tree got closer, Oliver realized it was in fact a colossal means a very, very big Rubian with a giant tree for a body. So the tree was a Rubian, was like a superhero, okay? Superhero person, okay? He wore a solemn face, that means a very serious face, and had deep sad eyes hidden inside huge folds of tree bark. Deep wrinkles covered his face as if years of wisdom were etched into his bark-like skin. The giant tree man screeched to a halt in front of Oliver. Every Rubian who sat on his branches wore long black robes and looked at least in their 60s, so they are probably 60-something years old, so very old and wise people. Many of them stared sternly, that means fiercely, at Oliver. So let's look at that tree. So this is the Rubian, this is a tree with many people in their 60s, okay, perched on the trees in long black robes like that, okay. The tree man lowered one particularly robed Rubian who stormed furiously towards Oliver. Skinny and tall, his head resembled, that means looked like a giant grain of rice, pale, long and oval. So over here, I think this one over here, okay. His white eyebrows were so long they almost touched his ears, and he wore a strange hat that looked too small for his long head. "Oliver Kim, how could you?" he roared. Oliver cocked an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" he asked. "How rude!" the old man shouted. "Don't you know who you're talking to? I'm Mr. Broomwick, chairman of the school council." So this is all the people from the school council. They are leaders of the school, okay? And this is Mr. Broomwick. He's the leader of the school council, okay? Chairman of the school council. Just then, Mrs. Woodsworth and Mr. Chapman arrived, panting heavily. "Mr. Broomwick, please! You're making a huge mistake!" Mrs. Woodsworth protested in between breaths. Mr. Broomwick turned his head backwards and stared at Mr. Woodsworth from the corner of his eye. "Silence, Mrs. Woodsworth. I've had enough of your lies," he growled. Mrs. Woodsworth scrunched up her face. "I did not lie, Mr. Broomwick," she spoke in frustration. "You just refuse to believe we have found Oliver's power." "How many times must I tell you, Mrs. Woodsworth, a weapon is not a power?" Mr. Broomwick replied sharply before facing Oliver again. "Oliver Kim, it was bad enough you used alien technology to pretend you have superhero powers. But to get the principal and the discipline master involved in the deception, that means the lie, is unforgivable. If someone had not told me about Mrs. Woodsworth's secret trips to your house, I would still have been kept in the dark. That means he would still not know about the secret, okay? "Mrs. Broomwick, sir," Mr. Chapman pleaded. We are already at the war room. Why don't you let Oliver demonstrate his weapon? I promise he'll prove you wrong." Mr. Broomwick stared wide-eyed at Mr. Chapman with shock and anger. "Do you still not understand, Mr. Chapman?" he retorted. "If Oliver is allowed to use his weapon, we will be telling all our students that technology can replace superpowers. We might as well just close the school and make this thing," that means Oliver's weapon, "for everyone." Mr. Broomwick roared, pointing at Oliver's weapon. "I've made up my mind. Stop interrupting me." Mr. Broomwick turned to face Oliver, wearing a spiteful smile. Spiteful, that means like an evil smile. "Oliver Kim, you thought you could hide behind Mrs. Woodsworth? Well, think again. I have just suspended her." Suspended, that means Mr. Broomwick has told Mrs. Woolsworth that she has to stop working as a principal now, okay, for a while, was suspended as for a while, okay. Oliver covered his mouth in shock. But that's not all, Mr. Brunswick sneered. The school council has appointed me as acting principal. So now Mrs. Brunswick will be the acting principal. He'll be the principal replacing Mrs. Woolsworth, okay? And my first action as acting principal is to expel you, to kick you out from school. Mr. Brunswick, Mrs. Woolsworth and Mr. Chapman protested in unison. But Mr. Brunswick ignored them. He rushed towards Oliver and grabbed him by the collar. Suddenly there was a blinding flash. When Oliver regained his sight, he found himself outside the school gate. It was 5 miles away from the war room. So I think Mr. Brunswick used his superpower, his flashing superpower, to transport Oliver out of school, okay? This is what a superpower looks like, Mr. Kim. He sniggered. Now stay out of my school, he yelled, before disappearing in another flash. Dumbfounded, that means Oliver's amazed or astonished, okay? Oliver remained frozen as he looked through the school gate. What had just happened? Okay?